Welcome back to the Sawmill, guys. If you're new to the channel, my name's Chris, and today I want to talk about how I approach cutting a tapered log. Now, if you're into a woods that has, say, a lot of nice tall spruce trees or hardwoods, you might not run into tapered logs that much, so it might not be a big deal to you. Here on our farm, we have a lot of cedar, white cedar, and pretty much every log that you run into here has a pretty big taper to it. This log on this end's a bit oval shaped, but the widest part that I measured is 15 inches, and down on this side it's 10 inches. So you've got a 5-inch difference in the diameter from end to end, and it's only an 8-foot log. And I've run into logs that are a lot more tapered than that, but this was the next one in the pile, so I just threw that up here. So I want to go over kind of how I approach cutting logs like this, and maybe you can pick up a few pointers or tips along the way. So I've watched a lot of videos also on how other people approach the same thing. I'd say one of the main points of contention, I guess you'd say, is what end should you start from? Should you start from the smaller end? Or better put, should you have the smaller end towards the mill or the bigger end of the log towards the mill? I've heard the arguments from both sides. In my personal opinion, once you learn what you're doing, I don't think it really matters. I think it matters a lot more that you actually take your time and figure it out properly. This one, the big end, when I put it on the forks of the backhoe, the big end was pointing towards the mill, so that's just how it ended up. So that's how I'm going to be cutting this log. A lot of the points that I've heard for starting from the smaller end, although I've never had a problem with this, some people do say that you get less chance of ending up with a wavy cut if you start from the smaller end, because it's a lot easier for the blade to enter a smaller piece of lumber and then gradually get bigger and bigger as you go along the log. Personally, I've never seen that. I've started from the bigger end a lot, and I guess the other main thing is that if you start from the smaller end, you'll always get a nice big full cut all the way through the log. My counter argument to that, and especially if you're starting out, and why I liked always having the big end towards the mill when you're starting out, is that it's true that if you're starting on the bigger end, it can be more time consuming because you might only get this far through the log and then your blade will come out into the air kind of thing, and then you'll have to go back and start again. But my counter argument to that is I'd rather have that happen than what can happen is if you start at the small end and start taking off what you think is going to be a decent cut. If it's a really tapered log, some of the times by the time you get down to the big end, you could be, and especially on the bigger logs, you could end up with a slab this thick that maybe you could have got 3 or 4 8-foot 1-inch boards kind of thing out of the slab that you're going to throw out. Now, I do understand that if that happened, you could throw that slab back on the mill and cut that, but just in my opinion, when you're starting out, it's easier just to start from the big end, and it's a lot, I guess, less likely that you'll make a big mistake and end up with a lot of waste. So that's kind of the counter arguments from both sides, or the couple that have stuck in my head anyways. And like I was saying, I don't really sweat it now. Whatever way the log ends up, I'm perfectly comfortable cutting it either way kind of thing. So let's get into why this is important. If you look at a log from the end, you'll notice the very center points. It's called the pith on each end. And just in case you're not familiar, this little center point on each end of the log, that's what I'm talking about. So why is that important when we're cutting lumber, and especially when we're cutting logs that are tapered? Well, if you can imagine those two center points, that's actually where the tree started growing, and from there each year you get your ring and it grows around from there. So that line is how the tree naturally grew. So if you want to, just one way to avoid warping lumber, if you can follow that line as closely as possible, you're more likely to end up with nice straight lumber that's not going to warp on you. And another reason is that although not always, those two lines are usually very close to the center of the log. So if you get those aligned with your sawmill blade rolling down the track, that's probably going to be very close to the point where you're going to end up with the least amount of waste. I have covered this topic a little bit in some of my other videos. I've never made a specific video on this, so that's why I figured that making a specific video about dealing with tapered logs would be kind of searchable, and if somebody's looking for that particular topic, then this would be the video for you. So one of the things on tapered logs you're going to need to do almost every time is raise the small end of the log up in the air a little bit. And to do that, what I've bought this tow board here because I'm dealing with such tapered logs all the time. I thought that was a worthwhile investment. Before I got this, I would just kind of hand lift the log up, shove some wood underneath it until I got it to the right height. That also works. I know some people have also made up kind of their own homemade tow boards that would probably work just as well as this one. So there's lots of ways that you can accomplish the same thing that I'm about to show you, but I just thought I'd throw that in there, that you're gonna need a way to get the small end up in the air a little bit. So the first thing I usually do, because there's usually lots of lumber laying around at the sawmill, I'll just grab a flat board, and just to kind of give myself an idea of what I'm looking at, I'll measure up to see how the distance is from this board up to the pith on this end. And right now I'm looking at 9 inches. Then I'll go down to the other end, check the same thing. And as I'm measuring this end, I'm at about 11 inches, which is pretty close, because if you think about it, this whole log was 5 inches bigger on this end than that end. So to the center point, 2 inches doesn't seem too unrealistic. That's not quite half, but I'm gonna go down to this end now, raise it up a bit, and then I'll just recheck a couple times to get it into the right spot so that the pith on each end is the exact same distance up from the track, and then that'll let me know that I can make my first cut. Okay guys, I'm within about 1/2 of an inch now, so I'll just crank this up a tiny bit. And I've got about 10 1/4 there now. Alright guys, that's close enough for me. We're really good on the center of this log being parallel to the tracks, which lets me know that my blade will be running through this log parallel to the center, how it's grown. So I'm comfortable with that. This is on the big end up towards the blade, so I'm gonna start my pass, and I can kind of go in a few times. The blade will probably come out halfway down the log, but that might allow me to get a couple usable boards before I really get this whole top squared off the way that I want it to flip over onto the other side. So let's make a couple passes now, and then we'll move on from there. So this is where things kind of get interesting. There's so many different ways of doing it. As you can probably tell on this particular log that I'm cutting right now, it's a nice big clean cut all the way down. This is probably the area where it gets the smallest on this log, and as I'm looking at it, I probably want to get down a bit more right here before I turn the log over. So what I'll do is just drop the blade down 1 more inch and take an inch board off here. I'm not going to worry about getting it squared off right now. I'll throw this board to the side in a pile of similar boards like that I have, and then I can square them up afterwards. So that's looking a lot better. I got a decent cut all the way through now. I would be comfortable with flipping it over so I can square it off. Now, since we're working in 3-dimensional space here, the way you have to think about this is that this cut that I've done is running parallel to the log from the track. So I can flip this right over and set this flat edge on top of the bunks, and that will give me my other side parallel. So I'm good that way. Now, because I haven't made any cuts, if we're looking at the log this way, because I haven't made any cuts up and down, I don't have anything running parallel this way. So before I put my toe board down, what I can do is just turn this log 90 degrees this way, set this flat side against my log stops and make a pass, and then I'll know that on perpendicular sides that I have 2 cuts and they're both running parallel to the pith, and then from there on out I can just set any flat side on top of the bunks and I'll be good to go from there on in. So that's the next step now, is I'm just going to turn this log 90 degrees against the log stops, clamp it down, and make my next cut. And what I'll do for right now is I'll just leave my toe board in place where it is until I get this turned around and I can get a measurement just to see how we're doing. Okay, there, now that I've got this in place, I'll break out the tape measure and board again and just give it a check this way on. 10 inches and about 9 7/8, so that is definitely close enough for me. Always good to double check though. So now basically it's repeating the last process. I'll do the same thing and take off a bit until I get this side, or the top, down to where it's in a good spot that I can flip it over. All right, so I can flip this over, edge it off, and that'll give me another good 1-inch board to deal with. And then from this side you can kind of see the cant shaping up. It's nice and clean down to about here. Then there's a little bit of bark here, but I'm not going for perfection, so I think that's going to be good enough for me to decide that, okay, that's a good start to a cant. Let's flip it over and start to see what size of lumber we can get out of this. So now that you have those 2 sides cut, now's the time that I like to tell myself that you can just completely forget about this log ever being tapered now. You just get your toe board or your pieces of wood or whatever you're using and just get it right out of here. You won't need this anymore. And now you can just go back to pretending like this is a perfect cylinder of a log, that you don't have to worry about that anymore. All you have to do is make sure one of the flat sides is sitting on the bunk and you're good to go from here on out. Okay, so what I've ended up doing is taking off a couple inch boards, and then that gets me down to where I have a 6-inch depth here. So basically what I'll do is just stand this up and do the same thing. I'll take off a couple boards till I get down to 6 inches again, and that'll leave me with a 6x6. Well, there we go, guys. Ended up with a 6x6 that I can either leave like this, or I can make it into some 2x6s later. I've got a 2x6. I've got a few 1-inch boards that I can edge up and use for other things. And I just hope that if you're just starting out, looking for information on how to sawmill, that I'm not an expert like I always say, but hopefully that just gives you a little bit more information on how you can approach cutting a tapered log to end up with lumber that's hopefully not really warped, that'll stay straight for you, and also so that you don't waste a lot of the log as you're cutting through it. Anyways, guys, that's going to be everything for me today. Thanks a lot for watching, and I'll see you next time.